I'm Ian Lesser from GMF in Brussels, and I'm assuming that you can see me on the screen. All okay? Good? All right. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for our conversation on tension in the Eastern Mediterranean, the way out. This is an issue that has been in the news for obvious reasons. It is arguably, the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean is arguably one of the leading flashpoints, not just on Europe's periphery, but globally these days. And we're perhaps holding this conversation in a slightly more optimistic week since the Greece and Turkey have agreed to restart exploratory talks with each other that have been in abeyance for 4 years. And there are also talks on a technical level at NATO. But the situation remains extremely tense. There is much to talk about in terms of the problem itself, but also how to get out of it and what are some near and long-term solutions. We have 3 wonderful speakers with us today, friends of GMF, but also people who've been very active in writing and speaking on this question, and we thank them for being with us. And let me just say a word briefly about who we have with us today. First, we have Nathalie Tocci, director of the Istituto Affari, Internazionali in Rome. And Nathalie, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Sir Michael Leigh, who has a number of hats actually now, a senior fellow at Bruegel and the academic director of the European Public Policy Program at Johns Hopkins SAIS in Bologna. So Michael, thanks for joining us. And Gerald Knaus, who is the founding chairman of the European Stability Initiative. All well-known observers on this topic. Great to have them with us. Let me say at the outset also a very big thank you to our partners in this. GMF has a partnership with the Union of Chambers and Commodity Exchanges of Turkey, TOB, and Kadri Taştan, my colleague, who is the senior fellow, the TOB senior fellow for Turkey, Europe, and global issues, based with me here in Brussels, has put together a fantastic program for the last few years, and that continues, and a big thanks to him for organizing all of this. Let me just give you a little bit of a roadmap as to what we're going to do. We have an hour and a half. We've asked our speakers to, well, speak. It's a conversation, but let me use the term speak very, very briefly at the beginning, just to give us a little bit of a sense of where they're coming from in terms of the diagnosis of the problem, but also some possibilities and solutions, whether it's about resolution or it's about containment, we can discuss. But we'll do a little bit of that, then we'll have a bit of back and forth among the speakers. And then we're going to open it up to all of you who've joined us today. You can send us questions using the Q&A function on Zoom, and you'll see that at the bottom of your screen. Not the chat function, but the Q&A function, and I'll be happy to try to take as many of those as I can. So let me just leap right in, and maybe Nathalie, I could start with you. Give us a sense of, what's the problem here, and how do we get out of it?
Okay, well, the problem, or rather, what are the sets of problems here? Because if one looks at it narrowly, well, one can basically say, well, there is a conflict, or there has been a conflict between Greece, or a set of conflicts, rather, between Greece and Turkey, pretty much dating back from 1830, a number of unresolved issues, be it the maritime waters, demilitarization of the islands, the status of the islands. I mean, there are a number of issues which compose, if you like, the Greek-Turkish dispute. Obviously, there has been a Cyprus conflict, at least since 1963, and essentially these are 2 sets of conflicts which have coexisted for decades now. At times, there have been flare-ups, one only needs to sort of recall back, Inya Kardak back in 1997, of course, the 1974 Turkish military intervention and then occupation of northern Cyprus, the 1963 constitutional breakdown of the Republic of Cyprus. So there have been sort of flare-ups of these conflicts in the past, but basically this is what we were talking about. What we've been seeing over the course of the last decade, in fact, almost 15 years now, has basically been an expansion of both a thematic and a geographic expansion of this conflict. So in a sense, the conflict started expanding with the expansion of the European Union. So we basically have the European Union, which to all extents and purposes becomes a party to these sets of conflicts, particularly after the accession of Cyprus to the European Union. On top of this, we have energy coming into the mix a few years after that, which basically see the conflict, which was, as I said, a Greek, Turkish, Cyprus conflict, add you have a number of countries being added onto this through energy, Israel, Egypt, first and foremost. On top of this, we have Libya entering the mix over the last 5 years or so. And Libya stroke, if you like, the political Islam debate in the region being added into the mix, where we basically see, Egypt, UAE, France, again, being added on to this layer and layer of conflict. So basically what was a pretty intractable conflict as it was 10, 15 years ago becomes now an absolutely impossible conflict to resolve. I don't know, Ian, if you want me to say a few words more about what to do about it, or if you'd like me to stop here at this point.
Well, I tell you what, why don't we hold the what to do about it for just a moment, because I want to maybe just get a little bit more diagnosis. Then we'll come back to the three of you on the what to do about it, if that makes sense to you all. Sir Michael, maybe I could go to you next to say a word about this. And we don't need to say too much about the energy side of it, but I know you've been following that very, very closely. But maybe to get to the question which Nathalie sort of poses to us is it really about energy in the end? Much of the writing in Europe and the United States tends to suggest that, but my own sense is it goes way beyond that. But Sir Michael, over to you.
Thanks very much, Ian. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon and to know that there are so many friends and colleagues around the world who are participating in the discussion today. When energy was first discovered, gas, offshore Cyprus and Israel in 2011, it immediately sparked a discussion among geopolitical types and others as to whether these energy discoveries could help overcome the kind of conflicts that Nathalie was talking about, or whether they would exacerbate them. And in our more optimistic moments, we hope that indeed they could promote cooperation between the countries in the region and lead to overcoming these problems. I was with GMF for several years and we ran a major project on this subject. We published more than 20 papers that are still all available on the GMF website looking into just this issue. And perhaps unsurprisingly after this effort, we came to the conclusion that, alas, these resources have tended to exacerbate the regional conflicts rather than provide common interest in finding a solution. And we saw already in 2011 the risk of escalation as Turkey sent vessels into contested waters to try and assert its rights. And we saw that there was a fundamental difference between the view of the situation from Turkey and the view from Greece, Israel, and Cyprus. And what we've seen over the years are these differences hardening into alignments of countries in the region which are in adversarial relations to each other. We have Turkey on the one side questioning the legal right of Cyprus and Greece to generate these large external exclusive economic zones, also insisting that there has to be a solution to the Cyprus problem and that the rights of the Turkish Cypriots to access to these resources, sharing these resources, should be acknowledged and accepted before Cyprus goes ahead with further development of the offshore resources. And we have the other side, if you like, the EU side, as both Greece and Cyprus are members of the European Union, insisting rather that Cyprus and Greece have a perfect right to establish 200-mile zones in the Eastern Mediterranean and to exploit the rights there. And I think the problem at the moment is that we have the EU countries digging in their heels and insisting on defending, quote unquote, European sovereignty and the rule of law on the one side. And we have Turkey on the other side contesting the legal basis for that claim. And on the EU side, we're saying we have the United Nations Conference of the Law of the Sea on our side, which gives even small Greek islands the right to generate 200-mile exclusive economic zones. And we have Turkey saying, look, this is preposterous when you look at a very small island, 9 or 10 kilometers inside, generating an exclusive economic zone of some 40,000 square kilometers. And we're stuck on this difference. And what's more, this difference is exacerbated by domestic political considerations on both sides. It should be easy from a rational point of view to have the two sides, mainly Greece and Turkey, come together and say, look, we have these differences, let's seek a compromise. But we are simply not there because the differences are too fundamental and they're exacerbated by the other regional conflicts that Nathalie talked about. So until now, it's a positive sign that Greece and Turkey are ready to talk about deconfliction, about taking steps that are designed to prevent the escalation of possible clashes at sea, like the collision between a Greek and a Turkish vessel that took place in August. But for the time being, these talks haven't really gone much beyond that. And maybe what we might want to talk about in part this afternoon is how can we get there? Is there a role for military force, as some believe, and in fact some are exercising military force in the region? Are sanctions effective or not? Or should we just concentrate on mediation and trying to bring the two sides together?
So Michael, thank you very much. You've given us a lot to think about there for the second part of our back and forth here with the speakers in terms of prescription. Gerald, let me turn to you and maybe say a word also about, to follow on from some of the remarks that have been made so far about the sort of changing circumstances. You know, after all, we've had what is essentially over 20 years of accord détente between Athens and Ankara, which is now very badly frayed. Why? Why is it badly frayed? We'll get in a moment to what we can do about it, but give us your thoughts.
Yes, well, thanks a lot, Ian. Thanks to everyone for this opportunity. Well, as you rightly said, there has been a pretty good period of Greek-Turkish relations in the recent past, which is, of course, not completely new. We've had, if we look back over the last decades, periods of great tension, followed by better relations, followed by tensions, followed by better relations. I have a timeline that my colleagues and I have put together of issues related to exploration of energy in the Aegean. And I mean, we only went back to 1973, 4, 76, 82. Every time we had the same scenario. Greece says it wants to drill somewhere. Turkey says this can't be done. Turkey sends a ship, and there's a whole range of these names of these ships accompanied by warships. And in the end, in between, there was the Bern Agreement in 1976 to say, well, let's just talk. Actually, nothing was resolved, but in the meantime, let's refrain from provocative actions. But in the end, the fundamental lesson I would take away from the history of these repeated tensions, and it doesn't matter who the president was or who the government was on both sides. What we see today is completely familiar. It's happened many times before. The end result was never an agreement on delimitation. I don't think you will get to that. The best thing you can get to is talks about delimitation, and you should realistically accept that there will be no result. Because as we just look at the rhetoric on both sides, it's being framed in terms of things that resonate very strongly, and having lived in Turkey for a while, you know, anybody who's been in a Turkish school, you know, knows the moment things are framed through this prism of 1919 and 1922, there is a very broad mobilization in the public that you can't give up even a square kilometer. On the other hand, you have exactly the same reflex in Greece, and the great nervousness and sense of injustice in Cyprus. And once things are turned into issues of territory and national dignity, concessions become impossible. So if we're realistic, on the one hand, the best case scenario is getting everyone back to talk. But is that enough? Because we've seen the very dangerous situation recently. And so what I would like to reflect on is there not another dimension to why we have these problems now? And there we recognize that at the moment, all relations between Turkey and Greece and between the EU and Turkey are in crisis. The EU accession process has completely lost its credibility, not just in Turkey, also in the Western Balkans. There is a deep crisis of credibility in NATO, which is linked to some big NATO members. But also, you remember the statement by the French president. There has been a catastrophic breakdown of cooperation in the field of refugees between Greece and Turkey earlier this year, and end of February, early March, which really spooked Greece. The sense that Turkey was moving people to the border. On the other hand, it really shocked. I mean, it was presented in Turkey as shocking how Greece was using brutal force against migrants after the EU lectured Turkey for years how it should treat migrants. The end result was that even on an area where for 4 years there has been cooperation, where Europe spent a lot of money in Turkey, where there have been common interests, there is now nothing. I mean, the EU-Turkey statement is basically dead at this moment. It doesn't exist. So we have a situation where EU accession is dead, the EU-Turkey statement is dead. We could add, other institutions which are in crisis. Now, this is dangerous because functional cooperation on concrete interests is always a stabilizer. And the good years between Greece and Turkey, the years in which nothing was resolved on territory, but good relations were still possible, were because there was a lot of areas of cooperation. How can we get back to this? And this would be my question. Is there a way in which the immediate triggers, and here, I'm slightly puzzled when people say it's not about energy. And I wonder what they mean. It clearly is a conflict that is triggered by energy exploration. Whether there is any gas that can be economically exploited is a different question. Whether this is really the goal of the players is a question. But for decades, every time there was a ship sent to Tassos or sent to Chios or sent accompanied by warships, every time we had such a tension. So in that sense, if exploration would stop and you create some sort of framework where you discuss endlessly without any chance of success on an agreement, the other issues on which, well, people won't agree. But if you find a way to stop exploration as a trigger for tensions with warships next to each other, and so here my question would be, how can we actually get to something as was reached in the Aegean, which worked more or less like the Berne Agreement in 1976? Could one get to a moratorium on exploration? And here energy becomes interesting, because I'm not an energy expert, but I've talked to a number of them recently. I've looked into some of the things that some very smart people who are experts are saying. And what they are saying is that in many ways, it's myths of energy that are driving this conflict. It's a narrative in Cyprus that Cyprus will be, perhaps with all this gas that is to be discovered, a major economic transformation. It will become a hub. But it turns out, many of the Cypriot experts that I've been reading say things like, none of this may ever materialize. Even the field Cyprus has already discovered, Aphrodite, might not be exploited for years. So what are we discussing about looking for new fields when at the moment it's not certain existing gas fields which are not disputed will ever be exploited because of the nature of the energy market? So could it be that a conflict that has many dimensions, as Nathalie pointed out very, very well, that is triggered by this vision, let's explore energy and make points about sovereignty, but if we stop exploring, this trigger is gone, could be addressed if two things happen. The myths about the riches to be discovered are exposed. There is a different debate that points out that a lot of these grand schemes are fantasies, that even again, just not as an energy expert reading what others say, It will take years for already discovered gas in the Black Sea to reach Turkish markets. I mean, Erdogan himself, President Erdogan himself said it will take 3 years at least. So in a context, and I conclude on this, which is very interesting. I mean, it's a context in which in the Western Mediterranean, a lot of European countries have basically stopped energy exploration. France is moving out of this field. The European Investment Bank is stopping to fund fossil fuel projects. Spain is not giving out any new licenses. And so I come to something that my colleagues and I proposed a few weeks ago and presented around Germany and lots of conversations. If countries would be able to agree to a moratorium on exploration, on new exploration, and if the European Union would offer these countries a concrete area of cooperation by saying, listen, let's explore in the next year and a half whether in fact it doesn't make more sense to take money and invest in Greece, in Cyprus, and in Turkey in non-fossil fuels, a bigger European project of moving towards an alternative energy vision in the Eastern Mediterranean, which actually fits in with what is supposed to be the priority of the European Commission, to give the Green Deal a foreign policy dimension. Isn't that a way in which none of the territorial issues, which I think might be unresolvable, will be resolved, but you would create interests and you would take the tension out of something that in the end might be a fight based on fantasies?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for launching us into the bigger question of what we can do. I'd like to also explore with you the question of who can help in doing it, which I'm sure we can talk about. But Nathalie, let me come back to you on this question of, what next? What do we do? But also maybe just to say a word, if you could, I'd be interested in your view about, again, if the problem isn't necessarily energy, except in a very proximate sense, as Gerald has mentioned, I mean, is it nationalism? Is it a different Turkish view of its regional aspirations? Is it a different sense of Greek solidarity with Europe? There are a lot of things that have changed since Emir Kardak, which you mentioned, quite apart from the question of whether the United States is going to play a role or not, which we can also get to. But Nathalie, back to you. What do we do?
Okay, so I mean, let me say on this first question, Ian, that I would tend to agree with Michael's view that indeed this is not about energy. So I have a slightly different view, I guess, from Gerald on this. Of course, energy has exacerbated, but what is ultimately a conflict about sovereignty and security. So it's basically just kind of given that conflict more of a bite, but it hasn't generated it, which is why if we were to get to Gerald's wonderful world, which I would love, in a sense, it would already be a world in which there wouldn't be that sovereignty conflict in the first place, because it would be a mindset that would be a mindset which would have already overcome the kind of reason why energy has become an exacerbating factor for the conflict, if you can kind of follow the circularity of what I'm trying to say here. Where I do actually agree with Gerald, and here I come to the what to do part, is, well, I mean, again, taking a step back from what I was saying earlier. So if it's true that these are different conflicts, and that therefore trying to kind of solve everything in one gulp is basically impossible, then the question is, how do you start unpicking them, and which is the relatively lowest hanging fruit, if there is one, to start working on? And I think they go something along these lines. I think actually, Libya is, and it may sound a little bit odd here, but I think Libya is the lowest hanging fruit. I don't think that the European Union and Turkey have fundamentally different interests in Libya. And I think that by being blinded by the East Med dimension of this conflict, we're actually not using the potential that we should be using in terms of finding ways of working with Turkey on Libya and preventing Turkey from increasingly simply falling into Russia's lap on Libya, where I actually do think that the EU and Russia have fundamentally different interests in Libya. So I think we're not doing ourselves any favors there. Yes, it's true Turkey has an interest in a friendly government in Tripoli, and it's true that they're going to get it at this point. Does that necessarily mean that Turkey does not have an interest in the stabilization of Libya? I actually think Turkey does have an interest in the stabilization of Libya. So I think there are ways in which we can work with Turkey on the Libya front. Greece, Turkey, I'm 100% with Gerald here. Probably impossible to solve it anytime soon. But hey, talking about it has actually been a pretty good formula for conflict management. And conflict management is not conflict resolution, but it's kind of good enough. And therefore, this is something that can and should be done. Cyprus, frankly speaking, I just don't see it happening now. You know, I mean, one can talk about elections and the impact that elections in Northern Cyprus are going to have, and elections in the Republic of Cyprus. I mean, I have been extremely pessimistic, and I've been on the record on this since 2004 on Cyprus. I didn't even believe that 2017 Crans-Montana really did offer a real opportunity. So I would look at it in this order, but fundamentally, the point is exactly what Gerald was pointing to. In order to do any of these things and to do them in a meaningful way, what really needs to be worked on is a reset in the EU-Turkey relationship. And a reset which is not simply opting or replacing one transactional form of engagement, i.e. migration, with another transactional form, but sort of bringing back this relationship in a contractual rules-based framework that is actually the only framework in which the European Union can hope to have some influence on Turkey. Forget the sanction story. This is not the way to exert influence on Turkey. And I don't think that saying it is representing a lack of solidarity. I think that actually fueling that illusion represents a lack of solidarity amongst member states. And this leads me to the question and the final point of who can do what. Well, very clearly, and Ian, you're best placed to speak about this, I just don't see the United States stepping into this game, regardless of what happens on the 3rd of November. Yes, perhaps slightly more in the event of a Biden administration, certainly more predictable and perhaps more constructive, but I just don't see the United States becoming a prime actor in this game anymore. Russia, well, yes, it kind of tries to, but not in a way which is particularly constructive. So let's leave that one out as well. The EU, as I said, is a party to this conflict now. I just don't see the European Union as being the main player. I think Germany has been trying to play a useful mediating role, and I think that should continue. As I said, I think that others trying to fuel the illusion of believing that by acting tough, we're going to get anywhere. I think that is actually an extremely dangerous game to play. But the bottom line in all this is that there is no external silver bullet that can solve this problem. And this is something that both parties, in fact, all three parties or all four parties, really do need to understand. There is always this illusion in the Greek-Turkish sort of, set of disputes in the Cyprus conflict that here some sort of external savior is going to come. And yet, when there was something positive, not definitive, but positive, the spirit of 99, how did it happen? Not because anyone kind of, kicked anyone in any direction. It came from inside. Then, of course, you need to have that framework, which, in a sense, Cyprus and Greece already have. It's the European Union, and that needs to be re-established in the case of Turkey. There is that sort of, conducive framework for that conflict management to take place. But ultimately, the recognition has to come from the parties themselves.
Mm-hmm. Nathalie, thank you. And I, sadly, I think I agree with your assessment about U.S. policy in this regard. And again, to take up your Emir Kardak example, I mean, it was critical to resolve that conflict in 1996 that Richard Holbrooke and others weighed in. But it was also, to go to the other point that has been mentioned, that the solution was in fact a bigger package, which led to things like the customs union agreement and other things backed by this earthquake diplomacy, which you had mentioned. We're in a very different world right now. Sir Michael, let me come to you. What do we do and who can help with it? And, given your background, maybe even to say a word about, the kind of test that this is for a more geopolitical Europe, a more concerted foreign policy. Is it a key test? Will the European Union meet it?
one of the problems for the European Union as mediator is that Turkey always takes the view that the European Union is not neutral in this situation, as two of the parties are members of the European Union. And that's why it's maybe a happy coincidence that Germany, which has such a strong interest in trying to strengthen relations with Turkey, has tried to take an initiative to prompt mediation as Germany, but it so happens that it's at a time when Germany also holds the presidency of the Council of the EU. So I think the EU as mediator, we have to be wary about that. The United States, there are some who see what is happening in the Eastern Mediterranean as a sign of what occurs when the United States withdraws from taking global responsibilities. And that each party then feels itself kind of unleashed. You can make that argument, but I think even before the American reticence reached its present point, there were no breakthroughs in this region. Perhaps the United States helped to keep a lid on things, but we didn't achieve conflict resolution. There are those who are saying these days, look at the breakthroughs between Israel and UAE, Israel and Bahrain. The US pulled this off. Why shouldn't they have a go here too? I am skeptical, but anyway, that has to wait for the elections. It has to wait for next year. I'm skeptical, but let's wait and see. So before we come to what could be done, I would like to join in with Nathalie a little bit about what I don't think is helpful. And Nathalie mentioned that sanctions are not effective. And I think that is true. But you know, one of the problems with seeing the EU as a soft power actor essentially is it doesn't have that many tools. And sanctions are one of the EU's tools. And we've got into a very uncomfortable position now, where the EU is seeking to impose sanctions on Belarus for gross abuses of democracy, rule of law, human rights in Belarus. And those sanctions cannot be applied because Cyprus in particular is demanding that simultaneously a new round of sanctions should be imposed on Turkey because of issues related to maritime demarcation disputes and energy in the Eastern Med. Now, and unfortunately, it seems to me that because we're in a situation where unanimity is still required for such things, the High Representatives basically bought into this. And Mr. Borrell is saying that these two sanctions processes need to advance in parallel. And somehow I think we have to find a way of getting out of that. I think more generally with sanctions, it's the possibility of using sanctions that might exercise some leverage rather than actually sanctions themselves. We've seen with Russia, with Crimea, with the Eastern Ukraine, that the actual imposition of sanctions doesn't really change behavior. So I think we should try and find a way to back away from sanctions as a tool of choice in this region. Another, you know, I think we have enough time just to eliminate another tool, which I think is not helpful, and that is military force and naval force. And to be sure, one can say that this began on the Turkish side with the Turkey sending naval vessels to protect its exploration vessels in the zone, and that the EU or European states are merely responding. However, it does seem to me rather inappropriate that there should be basically war games in the Eastern Med involving France, Greece, Cyprus, Italy, in a way playing bad cop to Germany's good cop. I simply don't think that this will work. It's not very subtle. At the same time, we have Greece engaged in aerial exercises with the UAE in Crete. What kind of message is that giving? So, you know, we had Mr. Macron in a way as the counter Erdogan on issues related to human rights, to democracy, rule of law and all that, but also choosing to use naval force to show how serious we are. And of course, there are other underlying issues there. I'm sorry to mention it, but Greece has just bought 18 Rafale planes from France and 4 frigates. some, maybe these were in the works anyway, but, you know, I think one can really question recourse to the use of force to defend European sovereignty in this way. So if we set aside sanctions and the use of force, what is left? And I think Nathalie put her finger on what is left. And what is left in a way is process, is not conflict resolution, but conflict management in the form of process. And that's taking place in the NATO framework in terms of deconflicting and preventing escalation. And even if we're skeptical that in the end it's going to produce a breakthrough between Greece and Turkey on maritime delimitation, you really do have two conflicting positions and two sets of external agreements, Greece with Egypt, Turkey with Libya. And we have two different interpretations of the United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea provisions on EEZs. And I think there is plenty of substance there for a process aimed at containing the conflict to get on with useful discussions that will reduce the tensions.
Thank you very much. I had an airplane, so I wanted to spare you all of that. But apropos of the airplanes, you know, there have been very risky incidents recently, not just between Greece and Turkey, but also involving France and Turkey and others. I mean, so this question of simply risk reduction, which NATO presumably is best placed to accomplish, you know, becomes very, very important. I would assume you would all agree with that, just to prevent accidents from happening. But it does also reflect on this question that you've all sort of touched on a bit, but comes in some of the discourse we hear at the moment. Is this, you know, working towards resolution of at least some of these issues, the process, as you mentioned it, is it basically a Greek-Turkish thing? Or is it helpful to broaden it out to include all the other stakeholders, and there are a number of them, many of them, plus all of the external actors who play into the risk reduction equation as well? Or is that simply complicating matters? Maybe briefly, all of you, if you could just talk, you know, whose responsibility at base is it here to reduce these risks and also to work towards the process you talk about? I mean, Michael, we can start with you, just very, very briefly, and then we'll go to the others.
I think in the last resort, it's got to be bilateral. It's got to be between Greece and Turkey, and they have to have incentives, and they have to believe that they have mutual interest in at least reducing the tensions. Others can lead them in that direction, as Mrs. Merkel is trying to do, as perhaps some future American administration might try to do. But really, I think the two of them need to see a mutual interest. And I think they do feel it. We've seen at times in the Aegean that they have been willing to, both have declared that they're ready to enter into bilateral negotiations, provided it's not under military pressure. It's not with a gun put to their head. And I think that responsible states, beginning perhaps with Germany, but also France and the United Kingdom for that matter. You know, with Brexit, it's been said, a bit of a cliche that the UK is leaving the EU, but not Europe. And the UK has close relations with all of the parties involved. So I think between Germany, the UK, France, and others, Greece and Turkey should be nudged towards bilateral discussions in parallel with the deconfliction talks in the NATO framework.
Gerald, Nathalie, bilateral, multilateral, what's more effective?
Ian, I mean, I'm with Michael on this one. I mean, I think that it is ultimately about bilateral, and it is about creating a broader context that enables that bilateral to deliver, as I said, not necessarily the definitive result, but a process moving in that direction. And ultimately that framework can only be a functioning EU-Turkey relationship for the reasons that we've discussed. And let us not forget that the member state that had the most genuine interest in supporting constructive relations between EU and Turkey, and did it not because, not out of, frankly speaking, generosity, but did it out of sort of an enlightened sense of the national interest, was precisely Greece. And it did it because it understood that ultimately that was the best guarantee for its security, because its security would not be guaranteed by warships and naval exercises or even sanctions, but it would be guaranteed by the kind of constructive influence that the European Union could have on Turkey. Now, what external powers can do is to help both parties get back into that mindset. But ultimately, it is the parties themselves that need to eventually act.
Mm-hmm. Gerald?
Yes, well, to build on what Nathalie was just saying, I think that is very right, that Greece, and I remember talking to the people in the current Greek government just before they entered the government, they were very, very interested in good relations with Greece. That's not long ago. Interestingly, just a few days ago, at the meeting of the Mediterranean EU members, Prime Minister Mitsotakis again referred to one issue that is a top priority for Greece. He said Greece wants a new agreement with Turkey on migration. I mean, he's been saying this publicly for weeks. Why is that? Because that is in fact an existential issue for Greece. There is, as we've seen, an almost impossible situation for Greece on the Greek islands with humanitarian conditions that are among the worst in the world. You know, you don't have refugee centers like this in Iraq or Pakistan. I mean, people being treated atrociously, but it's a deterrence, and it's meant to be a deterrence because there is no relationship with Turkey. So Greece, after the events end of February, early March, and I know in this government, because I talked to many of the ministers, there was a strong hope to make the EU-Turkey statement on migration management work when they entered into power, and it disappeared. So if we are looking for, now clearly Greece cannot make such a statement with Turkey because it requires resources to be put on the table, which the EU has to mobilize. So we come back to Germany. Germany, as a major country of destination for refugees, has an interest that actually is the same as Greece and Turkey, to mobilize again a package of money to help the 3.5 million refugees in Turkey to have a successful integration there at a time when the Turkish economy is in major crisis. I mean, Turkey is the country with most refugees in the world. So if you're looking for one area where Greece publicly and privately, even stronger, says, listen, here's one thing where we need the EU's help, that is in the EU's interest. And let's not add one more point. If you want to mobilize money, which is one thing, as Michael said, the EU doesn't have much tools, but money is one tool the EU has had and still has. If you want to mobilize money, meaningful amounts of money to be spent in Turkey today, you need to think of a pretty good story because Turkey is not very popular in Europe. I mean, nobody wants to give money to the Turkish budget, given how Turkey is perceived. But giving money for refugees in Turkey, which benefits Turkey directly, is a way that it would be supported in Germany for sure. So I think if we're looking for content to this relationship, here is one area to move. But the second one I get back is, if there's one area where the EU has an interest to take money and use it to create a longer term common interest with Turkey, it's an area that has been very underexploited, and it's energy. I mean, energy transition. The EU has these ambitious climate goals, but it's pretty pointless for the EU to move towards them when in the neighborhood of the EU, the trends are in the opposite direction. I mean, it's one climate. If you want to mobilize in a country like Germany, and I think elsewhere, money to be spent in Turkey, one good argument you could make is it's money that is being spent on reducing fossil fuels. And here we come to a convergence. If the goal is to reduce the burning tensions that have erupted every time since the 70s when there was exploration for oil or gas anywhere in these disputed waters, if the way to avoid these military confrontations is to not have exploration, then the question is, what do you offer politicians so that they can say this is actually not a loss but a gain? And here I think the vision of saying, look, take Greece. Greece is doing quite well. I mean, its national energy climate plan has the goal of 55% reduction of emissions by 2030. It has done really good steps. It will get major funding from the EU recovery plan to realize these goals, billions. Cyprus is doing very badly, and it will pay huge fines on its emissions very soon. It has very high electricity prices. I mean, to have a conversation with Cyprus where the EU says, listen, instead of having a cycle of tensions and sanctions and military buildup, actually, we are prepared to help you more than we are already prepared if it's part of an Eastern Med plan of using energy transition as a common interest. I mean, this is the Schuman idea of 1950. You know, instead of coal dividing countries, you have a vision, and there is, I know, you know, it's easy to be cynical. Turkey didn't sign the Paris Climate Agreement, and yet there is this big issue in the background. And it should at least make us think if there isn't a common interest in countries that are all maritime, that have huge potential for alternative energy. So here is what I'm saying. In the next year, get everyone to sit on the table to discuss all these demarcation issues, like Nathalie proposed. Have a framework, have a process. We know it will lead nowhere, but it can reduce tension. That's good. Then have a discussion on which concrete areas can you work in right way, where the EU has the money, where it has already worked, and which is in the interest of Turkey and Greece. I mean, a new refugee agreement is obvious, 1 point. And thirdly, set a vision up for 2030. Erdogan put his son-in-law in charge of the economy, right? He doesn't want the economy to crash. I mean, he has plans for his son-in-law. He doesn't want him to be responsible for the collapse of the Turkish economy. I'm reading about the latest downgrades from Moody's. You're reading about the reserves in the Turkish Central Bank. You're reading about the state of the Turkish currency. Turkey does not want more tensions with the EU and with Europe and with Germany. But it's not easy for Europe to help Turkey because Turkey has a very bad image, partly because of its own actions and statements. Find an area where Europe has an interest to help Turkey, which benefits Turkey and benefits everyone, and provides a framework to get rid of these silly exploration boats looking for gas at the bottom of the Eastern Mediterranean.
Gerald, thank you. You know, and even on a more mundane level, but it's extremely important, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the tourism economy in both countries is far larger than the energy economy.
Of course.
It's a strange, of course, point to make under the COVID conditions that we're experiencing, but perhaps over time it makes it even more important to be able to revive that sector. I do want to go to our list of questions. We have quite a lot now, actually. I want to make sure I get to as many as I can. There's some very good ones here. Many of them are anonymous. Some of them have names. I'm going to make them all anonymous just to make everybody comfortable. But I hope you hear your question if you recognize your question if you hear it. Let me ask you. The first one is a sort of fairly technical one, but you know, the question of the role of the ICJ, the role of arbitration, and the role of the ICJ. If you really want to get into the demarcation issues and the actual kind of questions of resolution, is there a role there? You know, it's very much the route Greece has wanted to go, but you know, in some ways Greece has perhaps a conventionally stronger legal case, but we could talk about that. Anyway, is there a role, ICJ?
If I may, no, I would say.
Okay.
I think that when Greece concluded the delimitation agreement with Cairo, it did so thinking, right, now we have two such agreements which are overlapping and are mutually inconsistent. Turkey's agreement with Libya and Greece's agreement with Egypt. The only solution is to go to the International Court of Justice and have it resolve the issue. But apart from the fact that any case would take 4 or 5 years and that the issues would still remain meanwhile, it simply is not, the claims of the two sides, the underlying claims of the two sides are not susceptible to resolution by a case going to the International Court of Justice. because if you actually want to take at face value the counterclaims, they are based on different interpretations by Greece, which is a party to UNCLOS, and Turkey, which is not. In a nutshell, Greece claims that even its islands have a right to generate 200-mile exclusive economic zones, and Turkey says, no, it doesn't, because this conflicts with a prior claim from our continental shelf. And furthermore, Turkey says, Article 59 of UNCLOS provides that in the event of differences, conflict should be resolved on the principle of equity. So the simple view on the one side that UNCLOS determines the issue and that you just go to the court and the court in the end will confirm this, I don't think is realistic. And it comes back to the fact that with two such differing interpretations, the only solution in the long term, if there were the political will to reach a solution, which I seriously doubt at present, would be through bilateral negotiations.
Okay. There's going to be a European Council meeting soon, which is likely to take up this question of sanctions against Turkey in this situation. I mean, I think each of you in some way spoken on that point. What do you expect this meeting to do? What's going to be the conclusion from this? Will there be one?
Let me perhaps sort of do some gazing into the crystal ball here. Now, let me put it this way. It's very clear that this is something which, as we know, was the level of foreign ministers, meaning the Foreign Affairs Council, was unable to resolve it. So it was bumped up to a more political discussion at heads of state and government level. I would be very surprised if, in a context in which exploratory talks between Greece and Turkey will be or look like they will be resumed. And on the other hand, the situation in Belarus continues to deteriorate the way it is in two contexts which are so clearly not comparable. I would find it very difficult to imagine that, particularly at a time in which the European Union is being chaired by a pretty relevant member state with a pretty, tough chancellor that doesn't really like to be bullied one way or another, I would be very surprised if the parallelism between the two was kept. I tried to put it as diplomatically as possible.
So nothing will happen.
Well, I think on Belarus something may well happen.
Belarus, yes. But, yeah.
But I would be very surprised if it happened on Turkey. I mean, of course, unless something dramatic happens. I mean, we know in the case of Ukraine that the mood over sanctions on Russia changed the minute in which MH17 was shot. So, stuff happens. It could happen at any point and the mood could change. But mutatis mutandis, in this kind of situation, I would be very surprised.
Okay. Gerald, there are a couple of questions sort of in this, and I'm going to kind of group them together if that's okay. They all relate to this question of sort of Turkish domestic politics and the Turkish scene and how that's affecting how this crisis has unfolded. The nationalism, the engagement of public opinion, the difficulty for Erdogan in sort of looking weak or backing off. I mean, how do you see that as part of it? How important is that in this current equation?
Well, do you hear me now? Yes.
Yes.
Nobody wants to look weak. I don't think anybody in Cyprus or Greece can afford to look weak. In particular, the way the issue has been defined in Turkey, it's been defined in terms that a very large number of Turks who might not vote for the president think that the Turkish cause is just. Just as in parallel, I think a vast majority of Greeks, regardless of who they vote for, think the Greek cause is just. I mean, that's why I think it's useful to have historical perspective. I'm reading these articles about neo-Ottomanism and Erdogan's agenda. I mean, when the president of Turkey was Evren, when the prime minister was Ecevit, you know, when the prime minister of Greece was Andreas Papandreou, it had exactly the same kind of situations, exactly the same. You know, a boat moves out and is accompanied by military boats, and then the Greek, and in the end, it always ended. And this is, of course, where I think this is more dangerous. At that time, in the Cold War days, NATO and the US was very engaged, and you could almost always count on them then also stepping in and trying to mediate. But I don't think these territorial boundary issues. I mean, you all know where this comes from. The blue homeland concept came from people who definitely are no supporters of President Erdogan. I mean, I came across them when they were put in jail in the context of the Ergenekon trials. This is not an Islamist AKP agenda, but it's been embraced. Yes, this kind of nationalism is used by governments to shore up legitimacy at time of crisis. That is dangerous. But I think one consistency in Turkey's diplomacy in recent years has been that it does know that, I mean, it's not a petrol state. It does need stability with its biggest and most important market. It will not risk a complete rupture with Europe. And it is not, I don't think, just a matter of personal sympathy that means that Turkey is taking talks with Germany seriously. It's that Turkey knows it might need, you know, a friendly or at least not hostile European Union, and that Germany is a key player. I think this gives Germany an opportunity that can be used to, also because, of course, there is a lot of discussion on this on these issues between Greece and Germany. It is a good mediator. I would not exaggerate what is new in this conflict through the prism of Turkish domestic politics.
Okay. A couple of questions have come in that basically revolve around the role of what you might call external actors, anyway, larger great powers playing into this equation. And several people alluded to the fact, and this is certainly true when you go back to the 1996 situation, that there's been a profound shift in especially American orientation when it comes to balance between relations between Greece and Turkey. The relationship with Turkey is now deeply troubled. The relationship with Greece is arguably as good as it ever has been, maybe better. How much does this sort of thing play into the perception of the parties in terms of the kind of weight and influence they have in this crisis? How big a factor is that? And I would include in this, you know, Russia plays a role, countries far afield like the UAE, but this US question is quite prominent in the comments.
Ian, if I may on this, I mean, I think, and you, I think you put your finger on the right word, which is perception. I mean, and here there is, I think, a big difference between the reality and the perception. I mean, I think the reality is basically one of, in different shapes and forms, US disengagement from this set of issues. And it's not just Greece and Turkey, it's not Cyprus, it's also Libya. I would argue that eventually it's actually the Middle East. So it is a disengagement that takes different forms depending on who sits in the White House. So it's a disengagement that can take the form of sort of, you know, erratic toing and froing, or a more structured, if you like, more predictable form of disengagement. But basically, I think the writing's on the wall there. But then the question is one of perception. And here I think that the aspect of, on the one hand, a US-Turkey relationship, which has obviously been an extremely troubled one in recent years, although a troubled one, which at the same time is also tied together by the fact that there is obviously a pretty good relationship between Erdogan and Trump. And I think this is also something that one needs to bear in mind. So again, there is a sort of a difference here between the sort of structural underpinnings of a relationship, which have become increasingly complicated and fraught with various problems and difficulties, and on the other hand, a sort of chemistry. I know this is something that is not just unique to the US-Turkey, but as you know, it is about Trump and a number of different leaders around the world. So, but anyway, there's a sort of troubled relationship on the one hand, and there is an improving relationship on the other. And I think the unfortunate effect that this is having is feeding, again, an illusion. And I want to emphasize the fact that there is the word illusion, that there is some big brother out there. And whether this is the United States, whether it's France, whether it's the European Union, that is going to step in and ultimately defend Greek and Greek Cypriot interests. And it's an illusion, and it's a dangerous illusion, because it's precisely that illusion that prevents the parties, those parties, from getting back into the mindset that they need to get in if they recognize that the only solution that there can be is one which is found between the parties themselves.
Mm-hmm. Other thoughts on that? Michael, how do you see that? I mean, you've been spending time in, before, when it was possible to do it, you were spending a lot of time in Washington observing some of this. I think you're muted, Michael.
Nathalie is right. A solution has to come essentially from the parties. If you do have a more active administration in Washington, from time to time, they can bash heads together. Ian, there was a time in our GMF project when we managed to organize some track 2 events, and we got Greek Cypriots and Greeks on the one side, Turkish Cypriots and Turks on the other together. They talked about it. When they were far away from the island, they could agree on some broad principles, and then they got back home and they were back where they started from. So, you know, the benign intention of outsiders can sometimes stimulate talks. But in the end, the two sides have to see a powerful domestic interest of their own in moving forward. And the sad fact is, this is not the case for the time being. We could talk about the various reasons for it, but it does not seem to be a priority at all for Mr. Erdogan in particular, to deconflict in a big way, beyond simply preventing escalation at the moment. He's maybe under pressure from nationalist challenges as well. His coalition maybe not as solid as it used to be. Even the opposition CHP, which in principle is, as it were, social democratic, is also nationalist and doesn't really differ very significantly on some of these national claims. As Gerald pointed out, the Blue Homeland didn't originate with the AKP. So as long as all those pressures are there, he's looking forward to the next elections in Turkey. He's very unsure as to the outcome of those elections. And therefore, I'm sorry to say that, you know, in the old way, not wanting to simplify matters too much about bread and circuses, I mean, on this occasion, I fear that a little bit of external tension, not to get out of control, not to escalate too much, he probably believes that that serves his domestic purposes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There's a question about, and this goes, I think, to something, Nathalie, you might have said at the very, very outset, but you've all alluded to it in some fashion or other, that, you know, at base, one of the key problems, challenges in all of this is this impasse in Turkish relations with the European Union. We've talked a little bit about things like sanctions, and I think there was generally a consensus that that wasn't going to be very useful. What about the, and Gerald, you did talk about some sort of positive incentives in terms of new projects around green energy and so forth, but what about other carrots that the EU can offer Turkey, if not to sort of fix the situation, if I can use that term, but at least to put the discussion on a better footing, whether it's about visa liberalization or other things? Several questions related to that.
Ian, I mean, I realize I've been sounding a bit like a broken record for a number of years now at this point. But I
you might still be right. I mean.
Well, yes, exactly. And, you know, and I keep on going at it, but I keep on believing and saying that so let's set aside the accession question, and one can have a debate as to whether it would be a good or a bad idea to formally suspend or terminate rather that process. But setting aside that question, the remaining question is, if not that, as a meaningful contractual framework, then what? And the only what I can come up with is the what that exists, and the what that exists is the customs union, and hence the modernization as the customs union as the only contractual framework on top of which, or within which, one can then build different bits and bobs. So whether this is the energy piece that Gerald was referring to, whether it's the migration piece, whether it's the security piece. My problem is that taken in isolation, those three things, security, migration, but also energy, risk becoming, like the EU-Turkey migration statement, a purely transactional mode of interaction, where inevitably Turkey has actually the upper hand. So the only way of bringing it back to that contractual framework is, in my view, the customs union and a modernized customs union. The paradox in this is that although I think both sides would gain from it, but I think that in terms of relative influence, it would be the EU that would gain a lot more than Turkey would. And the paradox is that who has been saying that this is where they want to go is Turkey. I'm not that sure that Erdogan really would like to go in this direction, but he's been saying that he wants to go in this direction. And who has been denying it has been the European Union.
Mm-hmm. Other thoughts on this one? Gerald?
Yes. Well, let me just let me pick up this issue of transactional relations, because as we've seen, institutional frameworks don't prevent conflict. I mean, Turkey and Greece have both been in the Council of Europe for decades. They're both in NATO for decades. Turkey has been an accession candidate for a very long time. It's been negotiating since 2005. I mean, it's been in the customs union since the mid-90s. I mean, there is a whole range of frameworks. The trouble is that a lot of them lack credibility. But especially, it's very hard to explain to the broader public what the real benefits are. That is why I think the right kind of common interest, I don't think it's just transactional, where the publics in the key countries all see a real benefit. I mean, this is political, of course. So the politicians can say, here we got something, can really, in an absence of such links at the moment, be very useful. And let me just get back, because I work on this intensively at the moment, this issue of Greece and Turkey and the refugee issue. We've been believing these cliches. I've heard them a lot in recent years. Turkey can blackmail Europe. It can open the gates. It can send refugees to Greece. And it's really not blackmailing Europe, it's blackmailing Greece above all. That's nonsense. As we saw in February and March, Turkey cannot mobilize large numbers of people and send them into Greece because, but here's the difficulty, because Greece responded with enormous force. You could say very harshly, you could say brutally. It suspended EU law. It pushed people back across the river. It suspended the right to claim asylum. It pushes back boats, all of which is a real problem for Europe and for the people in those boats. But it doesn't give Turkey much influence. The 3.5 million Syrians will stay in Turkey. They will not come to Europe. And as this is sinking in, it becomes clear that President Erdogan's attempt to put pressure on Greece was a catastrophic mistake for Turkey. It was cynical, using people this way, but it also revealed the limits of Turkey's ability to pressure Greece. At the same time, Greek feelings of vulnerability are real. If there are 10,000 people getting into boats in Turkey, pushbacks won't work. It will not shake Europe. It will create problems in Greece. So I think if we're looking for an area, and we are talking about a long-term investment, 5% of the Turkish population are refugees. It's the biggest integration project in the history of the Turkish Republic, leaving aside the Kurdish issue. 5%. They are not going away. The number is increasing because simply through births. And we have another 1.5 million IDPs in Idlib, on the border, Syria-Turkey. If the European Union becomes, as it was the last 4 years, a long-term partner to deal with this issue, You know that 90% of Turks in a recent survey said they are meeting a Syrian refugee at least once a day. Communities throughout Turkey are struggling. If EU funding helps in a cause where you can mobilize support in Europe that benefits vulnerable people and Turkey directly, that is a very good starting point. That is concrete. And that would also allow Europe to and Greece to stop violating international law and European law at its borders. So I think that is why I think Germany is right, and the rest of Europe should support this, because Greece is actually telling us all the time publicly, this is a priority issue for Greece. If Athens would have trust again that the refugee issue and its border would not be pressured by Turkey, I think a lot of nervousness in Athens would diminish. So putting energy and effort on this, which could work because it worked before, is very much worth trying.
Mm-hmm. Another set of questions relates again to this point about what could be done on a regional basis. There is the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum. Turkey has been very clear about its sense that somehow this has been constructed to contain them, certainly to exclude them. Would it help to bring Turkey into that if the parties would agree? And similarly, would it help in another way, symbolically perhaps, with an agreement to share income from any exploitation of gas in Cypriot waters with the Turkish Cypriots, which Turkey, of course, has been pressing for? I mean, are these kinds of atmospheric things, even under the conditions that exist, which you've all alluded to, which is to say that, you know, the energy markets are not very propitious at the moment, but are these symbolic kinds of things practical? Could they be helpful?
If I might say a word on that, Ian, I mean, on the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum, which was formed in January this year with its headquarters in Cairo. And just for participants, the participants being Cyprus, Greece, Egypt, Israel, Italy, Jordan, and the Palestinian Authority. It's been a dream for years, and we had a major paper in our project advocating regional cooperation, regional energy market, and so on. But surely this is not the way to do it. To form an organization consisting only of one particular alignment of states and to exclude Turkey from it. So if one is looking for incentives or confidence building measures to try and get a process of mediation going, then it certainly could be a role for the European Union and for the United States to persuade these actors that the EGF should be enlarged to include Turkey. That seems to me, if that doesn't happen, then Turkey is going to continue to see this as an anti-Turkish club, whatever the intentions may have been of the original participants. As far as the Turkish Cypriots' rights to the revenues from the gas are concerned, unfortunately for the time being, as Gerald pointed out earlier on, it's a moot point because the Cypriots have not found a way to bring their gas, which is some 100 kilometers or so offshore, to market. And there's a risk of this being stranded gas to such a point that the Cypriots have had to now build a regasification terminal to import LNG to supply their small domestic market. So it's a moot question for the time being, but the government of Cyprus has been clear for years that it accepts the principle that the Turkish Cypriots should have a share of these revenues and that there should be opened an escrow account once the revenues begin to flow, which would also provide benefits for the Turkish Cypriot community. Now, this may not be enough for Turkey or for the Turkish Cypriots. They don't want to see the matter handled by what they call the Greek Cypriot administration, etc. But the Greek Cypriots have accepted this principle. So I'm not sure that much more can be done in that direction until the revenues actually begin to flow.
Okay. Nathalie, would you agree with that?
Yes, I mean, on the East Med Gas Forum, I think, you know, it's impossible to put it any better than what Michael did. Let me just add that as a way to do it. And here is where I would come back to the Libya piece of this story, because, you know, one thing is to basically say, well, you include Turkey into the mix, yeah, but include Turkey into the mix kind of on what basis? What can it gain? What is its role in this game, which indeed has been precisely the opposite of regional cooperation, because it's basically been crystallizing one side of the conflict and bringing one side of the conflict against the other, and therefore tying these different conflicts to one another, therefore making them far more difficult to resolve. And this is why I would come to Libya, because given Turkey's presence in Libya, which is here to stay, and given Libya's role in energy in the Mediterranean, that is, and you know, I don't have very precise ideas as to how to do this, but that would be a meaningful rather than purely symbolic route to bring Turkey into the conversation, and therefore in the membership of the East Med Gas Forum.
Okay. There was a question here, it's related to this in a way, a specific one about, does Israel have a role to play in this? What do you think, Nathalie? Maybe a short answer, I suspect, but anyway, go ahead.
I mean, I think at the moment, Israel has been positioning itself very clearly on one side of this divide, because, as I said, it's not just about energy, it is really a deeper conflict in the Middle East. So at this point, I struggle to see how Israel could change the dynamics either one way or another, simply because it's positioned very clearly on one side.
If I might add, I think that Israel has an interesting role in the region. First of all, it was the first country to really exploit successfully its offshore resources. And it has managed to bring those resources on shore. I think something like 70% of its electricity is now being generated from offshore gas instead of coal or heavy fuel oil. Admittedly, this is not a renewable, but it's a transition fuel. And it has greatly improved the situation as far as the air quality is concerned in Israel, even though it's only a halfway house, Gerald will feel to eventual shift towards renewables. But also, in a sense, Israel has demonstrated the reality of regional cooperation in energy itself by exporting gas both to Egypt and to Jordan. It's true that in terms of geopolitics these days, and since its relations with Turkey suffered greatly some years ago from a number of incidents that we all recall, Israel is now, in political terms, closer to the Greece, Cyprus, Egypt alignment that is to Turkey. But nonetheless, Israel has close relations with Turkey. Israel's trade with Turkey, I don't have the latest figure, but it's 5, 6, 7 billion a year. It's very significant. And although I would never put forward Israel as a mediator between Greece and Turkey, the fact that nonetheless it does have close relations, whether economic or political, with both sides, mean that Israel is a potential player in any serious moves towards regional cooperation in the Eastern Med.
Okay. I'm conscious of our time, and I did just want to share a question with you and get the thoughts from all three of you. I mean, clearly in Greece and in Turkey, there's an issue about public opinion, society, the role of actors below the level of the state in creating a kind of atmosphere, positive or negative. I mean, it's arguable that when we last had this period of, important détente, which lasted for 2 decades, more than 2 decades, that civil society played a very critical role. And I define that broadly. I mean, businesses, others, it was fashionable. It was the thing to do on both sides, to be doing things across the Aegean. We've lost a lot of that. And it seems to me that's part of what is contributing to this instability. It won't fix the problem, I don't think, but it could play a very useful role, I think, in the context of other things that are going on in terms of confidence building and exploratory talks and so on. I mean, what is your thinking on that? How practical is it? Can it play a role? in diffusing some of this overheated nationalism? Gerald, maybe I can start with you on this one.
I mean, there is a big difference between the period of détente you're referring to and the period now. And it's not the dominant Turkish politician. It was Mr. Erdogan then, and it's President Erdogan now. But it is the alliance, the coalition he's leading is radically different. I mean, at that time, you know, he was pushing a lot of reforms, as we all remember, that brought Turkey closer to the EU. Now he is very closely aligned with the MHP agenda, which at that time was in opposition to this, but which was, of course, familiar from the 90s to all of us. Now, nationalism, the nationalism we see now played out on this is a very familiar one. Unfortunately, it's very familiar. I mean, we know it from a few decades ago. It's been there in the background. I don't think it's a failure of civil society in either Turkey or Greece. I mean, civil society is under some pressure in Turkey, as you all know. That also is different. I think civil society, the more contact there is between societies, the better. I always felt that visa liberalization was in the European interest. But I mean, I'm realistic enough. I know, having worked on this for 2 decades, that ministers of interior in Europe are very worried about visa liberalization with a country that produces a lot of refugees. I mean, Turkish refugees, people who would come and claim asylum and receive it. So there's a link between human rights in Turkey and visa liberalization. I mean, it would be great if both would happen. But we need other forms of contact. I mean, the more there, we shouldn't forget that in addition to the politicians, Turkey has a large young population. There is a lot of people under the age of 30. These people don't travel much. They haven't traveled much to Europe. I mean, this kind of investment in common projects where people meet and work and is crucial for the next, not just the next 5 years, the next 3 decades. This is why I think finding areas of cooperation, as Nathalie said, a framework, yes, and then within the framework, concrete things is crucial. You know, my children went to Turkish school and none of their classmates in a school in Istanbul had ever been to the European Union. They don't have passports. You know, these are normal young Turks. That's not good for Turkey and for Europe. And so if you talk about civil society, yes, there's the groups that know each other. You know, they've issued appeals recently. That's great. That's very, very good. But it's a broader thing. It's about societies not being isolated and trapped by a rhetoric of fear, and that is deeply rooted in the core myths of these societies.
So, Michael, the role of civil society, Greece and Turkey.
I think if one interprets civil society in part as meaning the business community, then there is an important interest on both sides in moving beyond the present tension and conflict. Nathalie mentioned the customs union. The customs union is blocked for the time being for political reasons, but there are economic actors on both sides who have a strong interest in getting beyond that, in particular, say in Turkey, road hauliers who feel themselves subject to taxation, to quotas and so on that are holding them back. If we could find areas that are depoliticized, like that, for example, and make small bits of progress, if we could get to a situation where Turkish road hauliers entering Bulgaria did not find themselves subject to what they see as excess taxation before they go on to the rest of the European Union. If we could identify a number of other low-key, non-political, more economic areas where business and civil society actors have an interest, and work our way round the blockage on the customs union and try and make small steps, hoping that the day will come when the politicians will follow through, then I think we could expect to improve the business climate a little and to create a better atmosphere for possible political negotiations. But this mustn't be overstated. These are very small steps.
Thanks. Nathalie?
I mean, I agree with what both Gerald said on civil society and Michael on the private sector, and perhaps just two additions, I mean, two conditioning factors to all of this. I mean, the first is that one can, and here I agree with Michael, one can create that social fabric. One can try and foster that social fabric and those interlinkages as much as possible. But as to the question of how politically meaningful they are, they ultimately become politically meaningful when things happen. I mean, again, if we're going to take, you know, the example that we've been taking over the course of this webinar, which is, you know, the climate of the late 1990s. What happened? Well, something happened. There were two earthquakes that happened that ultimately changed the mood. And then, indeed, that social fabric that you've been building on, that can, if you like, yeah, I mean, you know, so the flowers really can start blooming. So that's one reflection. The second reflection really has to do with leadership. And at the end of the day, yes, indeed, you know, civil society, business, this and that and the other is important. But surely there is a limit to the argument of one cannot do certain things because of public opinion opposition. I mean, ultimately, isn't this the real signal of what leadership should be about? So in a sense, I have limited kind of time and patience for the argument of saying, well, we cannot do it because of public opinion. Well, you can do something to change it.
Nathalie, thank you. And on the point about time, but not patience, I'm afraid we're really out of our time. But there was a final question, which is very relevant to end on, which is what did GMF plan to do with this conversation, which I'm happy to give you some thoughts about. First of all, it's going to be available for others who want to see it on YouTube, probably starting tomorrow. But also, we're going to do not a summary by any means, but a kind of reflection on what we heard, which is our reflection, but we hope reflects what we heard. And that will be available as well. And then, of course, through our Mediterranean policy program and other things, we'll be doing much more work on this over the next weeks and months. Let me say a very big thank you to our speakers. Nathalie, Sir Michael, Gerald, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you for sharing your views in such a lively way. It's really a fantastic conversation. And I hope all of you who joined us, and our thanks to you, and there are many of you still with us, a lot actually, which is really great for something like this on a Friday afternoon. Thank you for joining us. It was really a pleasure to have you with us. Allow me a brief thanks as well to, again, to TOBB, but also to Kadri Taştan, as I mentioned, to my colleagues, Özgür and Ceylan in Ankara, to Annika Vollmer in Berlin, to Jessica Siracusa in Brussels, and again, above all, to all of you for joining us. I wish you a very, very good weekend, and we look forward to seeing you again soon at GMF. All the best.